At the bustling corporate offices of Hartford and Company, Jasmine Daniels stepped through the revolving glass doors every morning with hope swelling in her chest. She had worked hard to earn her place here, graduating at the top of her class with honors and dreams of climbing the corporate ladder. Dressed in her neatly pressed blazer and heels that clicked confidently against the marble floor, she believed in the power of hard work, resilience, and dedication. This was supposed to be the beginning of something great, but reality, as she quickly discovered, had other plans. From the moment she arrived, Jasmine felt the weight of unspoken expectations and quiet resistance pressing down on her. She wasn't blind to the stares from her colleagues, some curious, some skeptical. Being one of the few black women in the entire company, she had already braced herself for the challenges she might face. But what she hadn't expected was the cold indifference of her boss, Mr. Thornton. Thornton was a towering figure in the corporate world, well-connected, seasoned, and with a reputation for being ruthless. His sharp gray suits matched his personality, crisp, calculated, and devoid of warmth. From the beginning, he made it clear that he didn't think Jasmine belonged. He rarely acknowledged her presence, often speaking over her in meetings, and assigning her to tasks that had little to do with her potential or capabilities. Instead of handling client accounts or working on strategy reports like her peers, Jasmine found herself stuck with coffee runs, organizing files, and taking notes in meetings where her voice was consistently drowned out. "Jasmine, make yourself useful and fetch us more coffee," he said one morning during a high-level strategy meeting. The room filled with the murmurs of senior executives discussing quarterly goals, but Jasmine could only focus on the humiliation burning through her. She forced a polite smile, nodding as she left the room, but inside, frustration gnawed at her. She watched as her colleagues, many of whom had joined the company around the same time, were entrusted with meaningful projects and praised for their contributions. Meanwhile, her ideas were met with dismissive nods, or, worse, completely ignored. On one occasion, after she suggested a new approach to streamlining workflows, Thornton barely looked up from his papers before waving a hand. "We'll stick to what works," he said, a dismissive smirk tugging at his lips. But it wasn't just the work. Thornton's offhanded, racially charged remarks cut the deepest. "People like you don't make it far in this industry," he once muttered under his breath after an executive meeting, loud enough for Jasmine to hear but quiet enough to feign innocence. Jasmine had stood frozen, gripping the stack of reports in her hands, fighting the sting of tears. She learned to swallow the insults, but they never stopped weighing on her. At home, she confided in her best friend, Maya, who listened with a mixture of sympathy and indignation. "You deserve better, Jazz," Maya said firmly. "You're smart, talented, and you worked for this. Don't let him push you into thinking otherwise." Jasmine nodded, her resolve hardening. She had been raised to believe that perseverance and integrity would carry her through any obstacle. "I'll prove him wrong," she whispered to herself each night before falling asleep. Despite the challenges, Jasmine refused to quit. She began staying late, working on reports outside her assigned tasks, quietly slipping her insights into team discussions where she could. She took every small victory, correcting an overlooked mistake in a presentation, offering valuable input to colleagues who actually listened, as fuel to keep pushing forward. But Thornton's shadow loomed large, and every step forward seemed to come with another shove back. One evening, as Jasmine sat at her desk long after most of her colleagues had left, she stared at the glowing screen in front of her. A stack of reports awaited her review, reports that weren't even hers to handle. She sighed, rubbing her temples, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. Just then, an email notification popped up. It was from Thornton. "Jasmine, report to my office first thing in the morning." Her stomach twisted in knots. Had she made a mistake? Was he going to reprimand her again? Or worse, fire her? She felt the familiar wave of anxiety creeping in, but deep within there was also a spark of defiance. She was tired of feeling small. She had worked too hard to be pushed into the background. That night, as she prepared for whatever awaited her the next morning, Jasmine made herself a promise. She would walk into Thornton's office with her head held high, no matter what he had to say. Because she knew something he didn't. She belonged in that corporate world, and she wouldn't let anyone tell her otherwise. The weight of months of frustration and disappointment pressed heavily on Jasmine's shoulders as she sat at her desk, staring at the latest project assignment. Once again, it was a trivial task, filing reports and cross-checking data that anyone could do. She sighed, feeling the sting of yet another opportunity slipping through her fingers. She had watched her colleagues rise through the ranks, each promotion and acknowledgement further proving that her hard work and dedication were being overlooked. It wasn't that she wasn't capable. She knew she was. But every time she tried to show it, Thornton found a way to push her back into the shadows. Jasmine had always believed that hard work spoke for itself, that effort would eventually be recognized. But after yet another meeting where her ideas were presented, by someone else, as their own, something inside her snapped. She clenched her fists under the table, feeling her pulse quicken as the room filled with polite applause for an idea that had been hers in the first place. She looked at Thornton, his smug expression making it clear he had no intention of giving her credit. That afternoon, as she sat alone in the break room nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, Maya's words echoed in her mind. "You deserve better, Jazz." And for the first time, she truly believed it. Later that day, during a weekly strategy meeting, Thornton was in his usual commanding posture, leaning over the polished conference table, addressing the team with his usual dismissive confidence. Jasmine sat in her usual spot at the far end, flipping through her notes, her thoughts swirling. She had had enough. Taking a deep breath, she looked up and, for the first time in a long time, raised her voice. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "Why do you always overlook me?" The room fell silent. Colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing at Thornton with curiosity, others quickly looking away, unwilling to involve themselves. Thornton, clearly taken aback, leaned back in his chair, an amused smirk spreading across his face. "Let's be honest, Jasmine," he said smoothly, his tone dripping with condescension. "You don't exactly fit the company image." The words hit Jasmine like a slap, but she refused to let it show. She met his gaze head-on, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. The room's silence grew heavier, and for a brief moment, the flicker of shame crept in. But then, something shifted inside her, an unshakable realization that no matter how much she excelled, Thornton would never see her for who she truly was. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. The murmurs in the room barely registered as she gathered her papers with a calm, deliberate movement. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's clear I'll never fit the image you have in mind. But that's your loss." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. As she strode back to her desk, her heart pounded in her chest. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, with a deep breath and newfound resolve, Jasmine typed up her resignation letter. Each keystroke felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, a declaration that she would no longer wait for someone else's validation. She printed the letter, folded it neatly, and walked straight into Thornton's office without hesitation. He glanced up, eyebrows raised in mild surprise. "Jasmine, what can I do for you?" Without a word, she placed the envelope on his desk. "I'm resigning," she said simply, meeting his eyes with quiet determination. Thornton blinked, clearly not expecting this. "Are you sure? Maybe you should think this over." "I've already thought it over," Jasmine replied firmly. "I'm done being underestimated and overlooked. I'm ready to build something of my own." A flicker of something, respect, perhaps, crossed Thornton's face, but he quickly masked it with his usual indifference. "Well, best of luck then," he said with a shrug. Jasmine turned to leave, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. As she walked through the office one last time, her colleagues whispered, some offering surprised nods, others avoiding eye contact. But Jasmine didn't care. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Walking out of Hartford and Company with her head held high, Jasmine took a deep breath of the cool afternoon air. She felt the tension leave her body with each step away from the glass tower she had once seen as the pinnacle of success. She didn't have a detailed plan yet, but she had something even more powerful: belief in herself. The setbacks, the belittling, and the frustration had all been lessons, shaping her into someone who could stand on her own. Later that night, as she sat at her kitchen table, drafting ideas for her own consulting business, a smile crept across her face. She realized that leaving Hartford & Co. wasn't an end. It was just the beginning of something far greater. Leaving Hartford & Co. was the best decision Jasmine Daniels had ever made. The moment she stepped out of the imposing glass doors of the corporate giant, she felt an unfamiliar but liberating sense of possibility. No longer weighed down by Thornton's dismissive smirks and belittling words, she was free to carve her own path, one defined by her talent, ambition, and relentless drive. Jasmine wasted no time. She threw herself into self-improvement with the same passion that had once driven her to fight for recognition at Hartford & Company. Determined to expand her knowledge and credentials, she enrolled in an MBA program while simultaneously working at a smaller, forward-thinking firm where her ideas were valued. The environment was a stark contrast to what she had left behind: collaborative, dynamic, and filled with people who encouraged innovation. For the first time in her career, Jasmine's voice was heard, and it fueled her desire to push even further. She surrounded herself with mentors, experienced executives and business leaders who saw her potential and nurtured it. With their guidance, she honed her skills, mastering strategic planning, leadership, and market analysis. Each lesson she learned, each challenge she faced, only strengthened her resolve to succeed. Slowly but surely, she built a reputation as a rising star in the corporate world, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo and bring fresh ideas to the table. Years passed, and Jasmine's hard work paid off in ways she had once only dreamed of. With a wealth of experience and a deep understanding of the business world, she took a leap of faith and launched her own business consultancy firm. It was a risky move, but Jasmine knew that the corporate world was hungry for change, and she was just the person to deliver it. Her consultancy quickly gained traction, helping struggling companies find their footing and achieve unprecedented growth. Jasmine's approach was unique. She combined data-driven strategies with a people-first mindset, understanding that true success lay in empowering employees and fostering innovation. CEOs sought her advice. Her strategies became case studies in top business schools, and her name appeared in industry publications as one of the brightest minds in business transformation. Meanwhile, back at Hartford & Company, things were far from bright. Under Mr. Thornton's leadership, the company struggled to keep up with the rapidly evolving market. His outdated methods and unwillingness to embrace change led to a steady decline in business. Clients began to leave in search of more innovative solutions, employees grew frustrated with the stagnant culture, and the once thriving corporation found itself falling behind competitors who were more adaptable and forward-thinking. Thornton, stubborn and set in his ways, refused to acknowledge the growing cracks in his empire. He continued to run the company with the same rigid mindset that had driven Jasmine away, dismissing new ideas and clinging to old traditions. He remained blissfully unaware that the very employee he had once underestimated, the woman he had sidelined and belittled, was now a driving force behind some of the very companies outpacing Hartford & Co. The irony was not lost on Jasmine when she received an unexpected phone call one afternoon. Sitting in her sleek new office overlooking the city skyline, she glanced at her assistant, who handed her the phone with a curious expression. "It's Hartford & Company," the assistant said, raising an eyebrow. Jasmine allowed herself a small smile before answering. It wasn't Thornton on the line. He would never swallow his pride enough to reach out himself. Instead, it was a senior executive she remembered from her days at the firm, someone who had once been kind to her in passing but never spoken up when it mattered. "Jasmine," the voice on the other end began hesitantly, "we've been following your work and, well, Hartford & Company is facing some challenges. We were wondering if you'd be open to consulting with us to help turn things around." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk. For a moment, she considered the irony of the situation. The very company that had once dismissed her was now reaching out for her expertise. With a composed but firm tone, she replied, "I'd be happy to discuss potential opportunities, but I have one condition. Mr. Thornton needs to be in the room." There was silence on the other end, followed by a nervous chuckle. "I'm sure we can arrange that." As she ended the call, Jasmine felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not out of spite, but because she had finally proven, to herself more than anyone else, that she belonged. She had built something bigger, something better, and now she was in control of her own narrative. Thornton's opinion no longer mattered. What mattered was that she had risen above the challenges, and now the industry recognized her for the leader she had always known she could be. Jasmine gazed out the window at the towering skyscrapers. The very buildings that once felt like barriers now looked like stepping stones. She had come a long way from being the overlooked junior employee at Hartford and Company. Now she was the one shaping the future of business, and she was just getting started. Years had passed since Jasmine Daniels had walked away from Hartford and Company, but the memories of her struggles there remained etched in her mind. She had built something better, something she could call her own, a thriving consultancy firm with a reputation for turning struggling businesses into success stories. Yet, when her phone rang one afternoon with an unfamiliar number, she was surprised to hear the voice on the other end. "Ms. Daniels, this is Robert Evans from Hartford and Company. We're facing some challenges and are in desperate need of an external consultant to help restructure the company. We believe you're the best person for the job." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, letting the moment sink in. A knowing smile tugged at her lips. The same company that had once dismissed her, belittled her, and undervalued her talents was now reaching out in desperation. They had no idea who they were asking for help. "Of course," she said smoothly, keeping her voice professional and controlled. "I'd be happy to meet and discuss the details." She didn't reveal her identity just yet. She wanted to see their faces when they realized who they had turned to for salvation. The day of the big meeting arrived, and Jasmine walked through the towering glass doors of Hartford and Company once again, but this time she wasn't an overlooked junior employee. She was the one calling the shots. Dressed in a sleek, tailored executive suit, her heels clicking confidently on the polished floor, she carried herself with the grace and authority of a woman who had earned her place at the top. In the boardroom, Thornton sat at the head of the long conference table, nervously adjusting his tie. His once unshakable confidence was now reduced to uncertainty, his face etched with worry. He had watched his empire crumble under poor decisions and a refusal to adapt. He had no idea who the new consultant was, but he knew their arrival would determine the future of his company. The room fell silent as the door swung open, and Jasmine walked in. The board members murmured in surprise, but it was Thornton's expression that held her attention. His eyes widened, his jaw dropped, and for the first time in her life, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. She approached the head of the table with measured steps, placing her leather portfolio down with deliberate precision. "Good morning," she greeted, her voice calm but commanding. "Let's get started." Thornton's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He couldn't believe his eyes. The same woman he had once belittled, the one he had pushed aside and dismissed as not fitting in, now stood before him, not as an employee, but as his boss. Jasmine took a deep breath and looked him straight in the eye. "You might not remember me," she said coolly, her expression unreadable. "But I remember everything." Thornton swallowed hard, his face paling under the weight of her words. The boardroom was thick with tension, and Jasmine could feel the shift in power radiating through the space. She held the room effortlessly, commanding their attention with the sheer force of her presence. Without dwelling on the past, she launched into her presentation, outlining a strategic plan to rescue the failing company. Her ideas were sharp, forward-thinking, and practical. She spoke with conviction, her voice filled with the wisdom and experience she had gained over the years. The board members leaned in, captivated by her vision for the future, a future that did not include Thornton's outdated leadership style. Thornton, humbled and silent, sat in his chair, barely able to look at her. His dismissive smirks were long gone, replaced by quiet realization. Jasmine had not only proven her worth, she had surpassed every expectation and risen far above the limits he had once imposed on her. By the time the meeting ended, the board members applauded her plan, offering nods of approval and eager questions. Thornton, for once, had nothing to say. As Jasmine gathered her things, she paused at the door, casting one last glance at the man who had once doubted her potential. "Success," she said with a slight smile, "isn't about fitting in. It's about standing out." And with that, she walked away, leaving Thornton to face the consequences of his choices. Jasmine had not only returned, she had triumphed. Under Jasmine's leadership, Hartford and Company underwent a remarkable transformation. Gone were the days of exclusivity and outdated traditions. In their place stood a thriving, inclusive workplace where talent and innovation flourished. Diversity became the company's greatest strength, and Jasmine made it her mission to ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, had an opportunity to succeed. Employees who once overlooked her now looked up to her, admiring her unwavering determination and leadership. She introduced mentorship programs, diversity initiatives, and policies that fostered an environment of respect and collaboration. The culture at Hartford and Company shifted, and for the first time in years, the company was not just surviving, but thriving. Meanwhile, Mr. Thornton, once the untouchable force at the helm, found himself in a very different position. Stripped of his former power and influence, he had been demoted to an advisory role under Jasmine's oversight. The man who had once ruled with arrogance and condescension now found himself attending meetings where Jasmine led the conversation, her strategic vision shaping the company's future. His seat at the table was no longer one of dominance, but of quiet reflection. At first, Thornton resisted the changes, clinging to his old ways and offering unsolicited advice that often fell flat. But over time, as he observed Jasmine's leadership firsthand, something within him shifted. He saw how employees responded to her authenticity and how the company flourished under her guidance. Slowly, he came to realize what he had failed to see for years. Jasmine hadn't just belonged at Hartford and Company, she had been meant to lead it all along. One afternoon, as Jasmine was making her way through the office lobby, Thornton approached her hesitantly. He looked older, wearier, but there was something different in his eyes, an unfamiliar humility. "I misjudged you, Jasmine," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "You didn't just belong here, you were meant to lead." Jasmine studied him for a moment, remembering all the times his words had cut her down, all the opportunities he had denied her. But standing before him now, she realized she no longer carried the weight of his doubt. She had proven herself beyond his narrow expectations. With a gentle smile, she replied, "It's never too late to learn, Mr. Thornton." Thornton nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. He understood that the lesson had come too late, but he was grateful nonetheless. As Jasmine walked away, the office that once felt suffocating now felt like a symbol of triumph. The glass doors, the long hallways, the boardroom where she had once been silenced, now they stood as reminders of her journey, of the barriers she had shattered. Her resilience, her hard work, and her belief in herself had brought her here. Jasmine had turned her pain into power, proving that success wasn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It was about breaking it entirely. Later that evening, as she stood in her office overlooking the city skyline, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had come a long way from the young woman who had once doubted her place in the corporate world. Now she was a force to be reckoned with, a leader, an inspiration, and proof that perseverance could turn dreams into reality. And with that thought, she smiled, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.